Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for sticking with us through some technical difficulties. My name is Melissa Wasser. I'm a 2017 Double Buckeye alum. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Vice President and Game Day Chair for the Ohio State University Alumni Club of Greater Washington, D.C., better known as OSUDC. On behalf of OSUDC, the Black Alumni Society, and the Kirwan Institute, thank you so much for joining us for our discussion tonight on becoming a more informed citizen. This is the second event in a year-long joint series between our three groups, focused on issues of racial equity and justice. I'm proud to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dean Lincoln Davies from the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Dean Davies is the 20th Dean and Frank R. Strong Chair in Law at Moritz. He's an internationally recognized expert in energy law and policy, and he joined the Ohio State family following 12 years of service at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. He received his JD from Stanford University and his bachelor's from that school up north, the University of Michigan. Dean Davies will moderate what I'm sure will be an interesting and educational and definitely necessary discussion tonight. Dean Davies, take it away.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's great to be with everyone this evening. It's always a particular pleasure for me to be with our Buckeye friends in Washington, D.C. I practiced law there for about 7 years, and so always have had a fond spot in my heart for anybody connected to Washington, D.C. It's such a wonderful part of our nation and a great place to be. Really looking forward to this conversation this evening. And what we'll do is we'll start by just asking our esteemed panelists to briefly introduce themselves and what they might have to say a little bit and just a little bit about them. So we'll turn to each of them now, and I think their screens will be coming up here in just a moment, and they'll introduce themselves.
Good evening. Thank you, Dean Davies. I'm Javon Collins. I'm the interim president of the Black Alumni Society at The Ohio State University. I've been part of The Ohio State University since I was 11 years old as a young scholar. So happy to be here and happy to participate. And on behalf of the entire Black Alumni Society, we're thankful for the DC Alumni Club and the Kirwan Institute for this opportunity. And we're excited about our conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Javon. Townsend, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good to be with everybody. Have family in DC, and actually my parents had their first date in DC. Anyway, good to be with you. My name is Townsend Price-Powell. I'm a longtime faculty member here in the Department of Sociology at Ohio State. My area of research focuses on mass incarceration and then the dynamics of incarceration in relation to other disparities and inequalities, its relationship to wealth inequality, its relationship to health disparities. And I'm interested in community reforms broadly defined and the role of an active and informed citizenry in the process of those reforms. We all mobilize something, and I would raise the question, what do you mobilize? And how will you engage in that mobilization? And perhaps this event can be useful in the broader answers, in your individual answers to those questions. So look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much. Brooke.
Hi, Brooke Curtis, a Moritz alum, class of 2015. I echo Javon and Townsend. I'm very, very grateful and honored to be joining this esteemed panel and moderator tonight. My background is in legal observation, got my start in civil rights work at the Civil Clinic at Moritz, working on litigation with those incarcerated in the prison system, bringing litigation against the prison system for violations, and have continued that work in numerous legal observation campaigns, most notably in the year after the Black Pride 4 arrest in Columbus, Ohio, at Pride, as well as last summer's series of protests. So excited to be here.
All right, thanks so much. And I think, particularly appropriate that we're having this conversation this week. In 2 days is Constitution Day. And so as we talk about what it means to be an informed citizenry, I think just another wonderful way we can celebrate this week and that day. So let me start with a question that I think is timely, given everything that's been going on in the news sort of over the summer and a lot of the recent political discourse. And I won't always do this where I ask each of you to chime in, but I think I might on this one. Critical race theory comes up a lot lately, and I think is talked about often in a way that's quite uninformed. So I'd be interested in hearing to each of you what critical race theory means and what role you think it might play in education today.
I'll let my colleagues go first, but if you guys want me to go first, I'll go ahead. But critical race theory is interesting for me. My background is I started my schooling in Rushville City Schools here in Central Ohio. And then after fourth grade, I went to Columbus City Schools, then Columbus Public Schools. And a lot of what we learned was not necessarily what was what it could have been or what actually happened. So essentially, I just don't understand why so many people are afraid of the truth. These things and incidents are well documented. But now with all the access to technology and information, most people want to act like certain things didn't happen. Even from those who have told me in certain states, they want to make it seem as if the indigenous Africans chose to come to the Americas. But it's really about the narrative. And if we want to continue to perpetuate a narrative that is essentially somewhat four centuries passe, and we're still keeping that going, I see that's why there is conflict with the teaching. Because if you're essentially telling the truth and what we all may have learned in our schooling, but now for me, nearly 20 years later, I'm hearing something totally different that I learned at the Ohio State University. So it's really shocking to me that it seems that people do not want the truth to come out. And as a youngster, I remember my mom always saying, the truth shall set you free. So until we fully have the truth, we will never be free. So that's really my thought on it. I can understand why a lot of people are fighting it, but as we see, a lot of the youth are coming together and bonding together based on what they've endured over the past 18 months. So we just have to be cautious because they will be our leaders in the future. So you don't want them coming back like, why didn't we learn this, when we as adults, we as educators, we as administrators have the opportunity to fully tell the truth to our students.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll build on that. I work in corporate DEI, so I've been in that space and I get the question every week. I get asked about critical race theory, which is not what I expected in corporate DEI, for the record. But I really like to remind folks that the space we're in right now, the academic space, is where that phrase critical, that piece of the phrase came from, right? Critical race theory, we have critical gender theory, we have critical queer theory, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're being critical, right? There's that just the basic difference of nomenclature and language that really hangs people up. I'm not going to come into your third grade class and teach someone how to criticize race. So that's where we start. We always start with language. But the second piece of it is, and I really love, Javon, how you put it, and that I think the power of critical race theory, which for the record, I learned at law school at Ohio State. Like, I did not learn that in third grade either. And no one's teaching it to third graders. I'm putting that on the record, that the biggest thing, this unveiling of safety among systems, is, I think, what really scares people. So that being raised, certainly not only as middle class and also white, the feeling and the trust that systems not only were neutral, but were benign, were helpful. And the unveiling, I really try to unveil it and kind of zoom out with folks who are struggling with it, to say, instead of looking at individual actions, can we zoom out and look at the systems and pick a system? I know Townsend's laughing because I know what system he's going to pick, right, to talk about this, but it's healthcare, it's education, it's prisons, it's whatever you want it to be, whatever system. It's not neutral. It's actually pejorative or malignant, unintentionally, or sometimes because of inefficiencies. That's a greater discussion. So when I have this discussion about critical race theory, I like to remind people this has always been the way it is. It's just understanding those systems. And I think that fear, Javon, that you kind of touched on, that fear of, I thought these systems were there to save me, were there to protect me. Folks learning the truth about those systems or seeing that truth in a different way, while it can be jarring, I do believe it's essential.
Yeah, this is it's been really helpful to hear the both of you. Really appreciate what has already been said. Distinction. There is how critical race theory is being weaponized and who is doing the weaponization. I think it is really fundamentally important to address that. But before I deal with that, I want to acknowledge and call out Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is generally recognized as the legal scholar to originate or really galvanize critical race theory as a sort of paradigm or means of engagement. No, she says that it's much more than a single worldview, one. And two, she says, think of it more as a verb than a noun. Back to Brooke's critical point about language and nomenclature. If you think about it as a verb, how does that, for Professor Crenshaw, her point is when it's framed as a verb, there's a recognized set of, to Brooke's point, set of systemic actions that are associated with it, and then calls to action among individuals who seek to engage with it. So there are a wide variety of ways in which it can be operationalized through the lens of both verb and noun. And I don't want to get too ethereal with it. I mean, it can be operationalized in very specific ways. So I want to get to those, and we can elaborate on those possibly. But I want to also focus in, before I go too far, in acknowledging how it is being weaponized. To think about it being an issue within the context of third primary curricula, K through 6 curricula, that's just not realistic. Just to reinforce Brooke's critical point, that's not reality. That's not what is happening. It may be taught in some law schools. It may be engaged in other interdisciplinary, in other disciplines and other areas of study beyond the law, within the social sciences and the humanities. And the critical point raised, there are a variety of ways in which to engage with informed awareness, to place value upon. There's a recognition of what racism is and what racism does as a set of systemic practices. All critical race theory seeks to do is acknowledge that racism exists and that those racisms in their expression create profound disparities in the engagement of law, in the engagement of those systems that Brooke spoke over earlier. So yeah, it is being weaponized into something where it's totally paper tiger. And again, that is because there's the need for an effort to mobilize around an ideology in ways that seek to create a convenient finger-pointed other. And that's what you don't even have to be specific about the group that you're pointing the finger to. Critical race theory can be this sort of ethereal thing where you're specifically othering other people of color, but you don't say that. You don't say Black people. You don't say brown people. And then you weaponize it as a means of creating a mobilization mechanism for individuals who want to use it in an identity politic among the right. And we can talk about the dynamics of what that is actually. But so I just want to, it is value its originator or galvanizer in terms of framing it more as a verb than a noun, though it is both, as she would recognize, as she reflects it in her work. And certainly within the other social sciences and humanities. A lot more to say, but I better leave it there.
Great. So I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I do want to plumb just a little bit further on sort of one strain of what we talked about. Townsend, you were just talking about sort of weaponization. I think Brooke and Javon, you both talked about sort of ways in which you interface with this on a daily basis. And obviously, I think when people use anything in the political arena, obviously, that often has a lot to do about power and trying to perpetuate or gain power in certain ways. And obviously, I think it's difficult to talk about race, just generally and particularly in our society. But I think all of you touched on something that I've sort of picked up on as you hear about this discourse in the public, and that's part of why I'm valuing this conversation we're having right now so much, is that we're engaging in an authentic, genuine conversation. I think something so missing today in society. But something I heard in all of your answers is this notion of fear. And I wonder if any one of you wants to pick up on that idea in terms of the role that fear is playing in the discourse around critical race theory today.
I feel like as the white person on the panel, I should definitely talk about fear because that is such a tool of hate. And that's such a tool in white communities, and also a tool that I have seen over and over again in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, specifically when I am caucusing with white folks. So even when we are working through discussing race, to separate white folks into a different space, which feels antithetical, right? That feels like segregation, and white folks will push back. And I say, no, we are having the Black and brown folks leave the room so you don't further harm them. So we don't further harm them with our processing of some of these challenges. And fear always comes to the forefront. Fear is always there. And usually that is where we have to start. And even if we're not starting there, that's the underbelly. That's always where we're coming back to. So I think that it has to be brought into the light on that, or it just kind of gets compacted. And I love what Townsend shared about, building on that one statement I said about systems. Gosh, I felt like I was in a class and I needed a notebook for that. So I'm going to bring a notebook, Townsend, if we ever do this again, because I love every single one of those incredible things you said. Look at you, Javon's ready. Oh, next time, Javon, feel like a rookie. Those systems can also be utilized to really have individual actions get lost in the system. And I want to make sure that even in those individual actions, accountability isn't lost to say, oh, well, the system is just like that. That's what happens. That's often a tool that is also used by folks who are fearful of change, are fearful of bringing race to the forefront, are fearful of having the true conversation. And usually that conversation starts with something like, I don't see color. And then I know I have a job for life with that group. So that's usually where that starts there. So I'll pass it to Javon or Townsend to pick it up.
Well, I'll jump in. I think of a song lyric I heard years ago, or something along the lines where I heard, people fear what they do not understand. And for the races that have been interacting for over 400 years, it just baffles me that seeing African Americans or people of color as humans was a challenge. And I always say, you got to know your past presently to get to your future. It's very uncomfortable to talk about critical race theory because it brings back so much trauma. A lot of trauma for people of color that is generational. It's in the DNA. There's certain things where they say it's a premonition. Maybe it's a flashback from an ancestor who may have gone through something similar, but just in a different time. For me, my mother's biracial and she grew up in the projects here in Columbus. And even though she faced racism outside and even at home, she taught me to always lead with love until you feel hate. And unfortunately, I've felt hate, throughout my travels, I felt it as a student at the Ohio State University. I remember just running down in an alley, running to my apartment. They immediately thought I was, robbing someone. So, and these are things where I had white roommates who could do the same thing and wouldn't have to think twice. So ultimately, we just need a better understanding of Black culture, other cultures for people of color. So there's that respect. And it's not a situation where it's great where, African Americans are creating great music, dance, literature, even great in sports. But at the same time, you don't want to be around them. You don't want them to live near you. It's just that contradiction that's been the undergird for far too long that has just led to us being at the point we're at today, where it's like, we know we must go forward, but the problems is so deep that we don't even know how to move. And even when you do move, you face criticism or, well, you shouldn't have said that, you shouldn't have did this. But, for us, Townsend and I, I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors. My grandfather never had the opportunities I had to be a young scholar and go to Ohio State. So I do what I do based on what they weren't able to do. And, for me, I can't have fear, because if I did, I wouldn't get out of bed any day, because anytime I leave my home, anything, like I discussed yesterday in our talk, anything can happen. And it doesn't matter if I'm an Ohio State graduate or president of Black Alumni Society. They look at me as another Black man who's possibly up to no good. And what resonated to me, a couple years ago, is the fact that I shared the same birthday as Emmett Till. And when I saw that, it just hurt me to my core. And to know now that the person who made the accusation, it wasn't the same, and that young man's life could have been saved. So ultimately, fear is it's driven the racism. It's and just the oppression. It's driven it. But we have to ask ourselves a question on humanity, and also about our legacy. What do we plan to leave for the future? Because our students and our children are more advanced than we were, just based on the technology. But are we using it for good, or are we using it to proliferate these ideologies that have been going on for centuries? So I think we have to do this together, but yet there's always going to be someone saying, no, you can't do it. But we have to fight, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but this is life work. I mean, it may not be at a point where it should be in my lifetime, but whatever I'm able to do to help the next generation and those who may not understand and have that fear, overcome that, that's what I'm here to do.
Thanks, Javon. And some of the words that you said and that I'm hearing, love, respect, systems, I think come all together in really powerful ways here. I want to turn to a question that's come in through the Q&A about one of those words, systems. And I know there are several systems we may talk about throughout this conversation. But the question is, I think, about the educational system and what are teachers or others, parents, allies to do when school boards are being attacked about, the potential or theoretical use of critical race theory. I know, Brooke, you mentioned, third graders aren't teaching this. My mother was a school teacher in elementary school for 35 years. My guess is she doesn't even know what critical race theory is.
So she is a critical race scholar then. That's how that works.
Yeah, exactly.
Now.
Right. Yeah. I'll ask her for some expertise next time I see her. I think she'll laugh at me.
Just a copy of the new Jim Crow right on her coffee table, just hanging out. We love it. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, written, of course, by an Ohio State law professor.
Yes.
So on a practical level, what are we to do? How do we engage on these topics? How do we push back when the education systems, that's why I'm involved. I know it's why my mother was involved. It's why my grandmother taught for years, is because the education system is the future of our country, and it's the children.
Yeah, and an adapted quote of Frederick Douglass, I would, you do what you can where you are. So I would say, that's why I return to, everybody is mobilizing something. What are you mobilizing in your daily decisions and actions? And if you have a goal in a particular interest, in broadening diverse curriculum or placing value on strategies of inclusion or recognizing the danger of curricular boundaries being placed upon, or individuals in open rebellion. I mean, that whole thing about vaccinations, which maybe we should, but so there are a wide variety of ways. And what are the ways in which what do you seek to mobilize? So once you answer that question, who can you be in fellowship with? And be in fellowship so there's micro political engagement, and then there's meso and then macro political engagement. And at each of those levels, it boils down to who are you seeking to come into allied struggle with to further what mission toward what end. And I don't mean to be needlessly vague. One can be very specific. If you feel within your district that, for example, there's, so Jonathan Kozol is a researcher he published Death at an Early Age in '63, taught in, I believe, the Boston public school system for many years, wrote Death at an Early Age, Illiterate America. He's one of the preeminent scholars across the years in educational inequality. And one of the things that he talked about in the book Savage Inequalities is the comfort that we have with educational inequality. So, and there are many, many stages to fix that. Our inequalities with education are not about making sure that critical race theory isn't attacked in a way that it's not even being used. So you're creating a mythical, you're weaponizing a myth, something that actually doesn't even exist. But instead, if you want to talk about something differently substantive, then perhaps advocating for broader equity in the funding base of public education, because our savage inequalities in education extend from what Doug Massey, Nancy Denton, and others have called American apartheid. We all know what apartheid was, and we frame it through the lens of another nation state half a world away. And American apartheid, there's a book by that title, published in '93. If folks want it, it's an outstanding work on the history. Back to what Javon was talking about in very personal terms, which I appreciate and respect on many levels, about going back generations. What are the ways in which systemic inequalities created the level of residential inequality we have? Columbus is one of the top 3 most economically segregated cities in the country. And so that's the reality of where Ohio State resides. And so so if one would choose to address a variety of things, what do what you can where you are? What do you seek to mobilize? Who can you come into fellowship with? And what are the micro political and then larger short and long-term goals that you seek to mobilize to enact a broader inclusion and a broader equity? And I just want to not leave a point just hanging out there. What I thought was powerful in an educational moment that we just all experienced, Javon intentionally used a personal symmetry of a birthday with an individual who was George Floyd generations before George Floyd exists. Although that's me mixing metaphor, because Emmett Till was killed not by law enforcement. He was killed by some Mississippi guys who were in a town that he happened to be visiting relatives. He was a 14-year-old African-American kid visiting from Chicago. And I just think we all may know, we all may have heard the name in it, and Javon presented it within the framework of a cultural literacy where we can assign meaning to it. And then I don't know about anybody else, but immediately, no, try and immediately one sees the photo that was published in Jet magazine intentionally by Emmett Till's mother to make sure that people saw just the face. He was suited up in the casket up to his neck, and all one could see is the level of destruction that was placed upon his face. So I don't want to go too far afield, but I just want to acknowledge in this fellowship, a name was volunteered that is a symbol, a real life breathing young male who had all kinds of possibility and potential in front of him. Happened to be visiting from Chicago, and he may or may not have done something that led to the ire of an adjacent set of white men in Mississippi who chose to then take his life very viciously and leave him by the side of a stream. It was used as a point of reference for what we know, how badly things can go. Let's not do that in terms of oppositional culture. Let us be better than that collectively. And perhaps we can engage systems through our individual personal mobilizations, micro-political and beyond, to further a level of justice in the echo of those who did not have any and who experienced a death where justice was denied. We can be better than that. So I'm very much going with Javon and Brooke in we can be better. And the how is engaging those. What do you mobilize? Who are you in fellowship with? And how are you going to engage it? And know that it's whatever we do, it's the increments matter. The increments of contribution matter. But American apartheid is still alive and well. We can make contributions to address it. And so that's the invitation for each of us as we mobilize moving forward.
So Townsend, I really appreciate you pointing out that symmetry and obviously and the power of both what Javon said and obviously the symbol of Emmett Till. I want to talk about an asymmetry for a minute. So we've talked a little bit about the educational system. Let's turn to another system. Let's talk about the police. Obviously, at the forefront of many people's minds, hopefully everyone's minds for the last year and a half, 2 years. You write a lot about mass incarceration. There are other ways in which the police have been front of mind, including notions of defunding the police and potential solutions for addressing the police. And at the same time, near campus, we've been having a sort of a spate of crimes in recent weeks. So I don't know who wants to start, but I'd like to talk about the police and the role of race in policing in America today. Looks like Javon.
Go ahead.
Okay, I didn't want to lead this one off, but yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. For me growing up, again, I make it a lot personal because this is my experience and this is how I relate to things. I've dealt with situations with police where just based on my appearance, I was a suspect. I've dealt with officers who have been great pillars of the community. I think of Officer Jason Jackson, who unfortunately we lost a couple years ago, but he was a man of the community. And, he did all he could to help save lives. And his thought process was to de-escalate and to give whomever's in that situation, if it's not life-threatening, an opportunity to survive and to see another day. I don't know why, and I can't say I don't know why. For some, they have different thought processes, and therefore it's carried out in their actions. I don't feel that every police officer carries the same thought process, but I think of Freddie Cruz, who was a young man here in Columbus, 1971. who was basically, shot in the back and severed his spinal cord. And he was 14 years old. And, from what they said, and again, all this is tertiary, people said, well, the motto was shoot to kill. And again, another young man who, again, they did wrong. They broke into the school, but did he have to lose his life for that? And regardless of what happens in any community, we if we value our lives, we should value other lives. I'm not saying as far as those who are out to take a life, yeah, they got to be dealt with a certain way. But those who are just trying to live their life and to get back home to their family, that's just a heartbreaking piece where, it's just so tough right now because we see what's going on. We saw what happened on campus right in front of Drinko on Saturday. We see that. And I think to myself about how I used to walk around campus and go into Baker Systems and writing a paper at 2:30 in the morning and walking on campus. And I'm like thinking to myself, like, why was I doing that? But at the same time, it was a different time. But even though those elements still existed. And it's what I feel is this: reform is needed and reform is necessary. I feel it should be based on de-escalation. I don't feel that the intent should be to kill unless it's a situation where lives are in jeopardy. But the way things are being handled and the way things are being discussed, I don't think it's in a position for the police and the community to fully move forward until they address all the ills that have gone on for far too long with the Columbus Police Department and police departments around the country for that matter. There has to be an open dialogue with the truth first. There's too many, artificial narratives that come out just to protect certain people. This is a humanity issue. And until we get back to humanity, these things will continue to rear its ugly head. So I think, the mayors, the governors, everyone has to be on the same page, because as we've been an open fist for far too long, until we close that fist, we can't expect any changes. And it has to be an effort, a collective effort, because otherwise, like I said, we won't see these things in our lifetime. And to Townsend, what are we mobilizing? What are we truly doing? And how can we create that connection amongst each other instead of, basically celebrating, disconnects and misunderstandings? Let's celebrate the unity that's needed for us to move forward together in the future. But a lot of work to be done, but it has to be intentional. It shouldn't be a Band-Aid. This should be something to try to heal these wounds. And we put on too many Band-Aids, can't even stick a Band-Aid on it to any longer. We have to address the wound because it's too deep, and we got to figure out what we need to do now more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the depth of it, I'll tell you, I don't think I've met a Black person who hasn't had an experience like yours. I mean, it's unbelievable. And that's part of the problem, I think, right, is people don't believe it because they haven't lived that experience. So let me ask two questions. You touched on reforms, Javon. First, can we talk about what is meant by defund the police? And then I guess second, maybe what other reforms or what's the suite of reforms that might be available when we talk about racism in the police system today?
Sure. Couple of thoughts. Scholars in this area, some scholars in this area suggest that some have expressed that they wish a different term had been used, back to Brooke's critical point about how narratives are understood. There's a graduate student at Yale whose name escapes me, and he talks about valuing defund the police because of its narrative utility, meaning it led people to go, and there's value in the, he would suggest. Otherwise, there would not have been him being in conversation or being an interview respondent for a PBS sound news segment in one of their platforms. So if defund the police was to be utilized for narrative value, then it had value. But his point, I'll repeat the broader point, and building on Javon, it's about strategies of reform. Many in this area emphasize divest, invest. So, for example, let's be concrete. Mayor Carcetti in LA can say, I will affirm a defunding in the amount of $150 million that will not go to increase the funding of police by that amount, and will instead be used to divest from the police and utilize for investments in community enrichment. And those investments in community enrichment had everything to do with dimensions of public safety from a neighborhood that both in building up the traditional forms, block watch, etc., as well as some individuals are criticizing him about added surveillance. So the very thing that's supposed to be a divestment in a form of social control that is abusing actually is being used to fund another form of by enhancing surveillance culture and the use of technologies so that individual cops can be taken off the street. So even the nature of the use of the term he use the language of divestment. And I'm just using him just because he's been in the public eye and gained national attention for that. So that can be problematic, but divest, invest. It's about raising the question of strategies of potential reform. So for example, a better example might be Camden, New Jersey, pre-George Floyd, pre-pandemic, way back in 2012. Camden was a corrupt police system on several levels. And so much so that there was a class action suit against various police officers in Camden, such that they paid out something like $800 million in civil suit money to individuals who had been adversely harmed, and reversed in excess of 150 sentences of individuals who had been. So it got really, really bad. But all those data. What's the point? They fired all the Camden cops, and they rehired a Camden security force. The average cost, and I have mixed feelings about this from a union standpoint, but the average cost per officer prior to that choice was about $183,000 per year, per cop per year. The rehiring cost per cop per year basically cut that in half. And what was more critically than that, they used a community policing model. So it was formal divestment and engagement in enhancement of community policing. What did that mean? That there was for a portion of it, there was a residential requirement. So that the individuals had to actually live in the neighborhoods either adjacent to or in which they were patrolling. So that there's an immediate investment in the local because it's their neighborhood too. They're mixed data on whether or not that residential requirement works, but the point is, this is yet another piece of the Camden strategy. Another element of it was putting together traditional stuff, athletic leagues, cops being foregrounded in having neighborhood barbecues. So it turned into formal meet and greets. Cops having the responsibility of door knocking, old school for it, going up to houses, not in moments of crisis, but just to engage. Hello, I'm Officer Johnson. I'm going to be here. You know, if I can be of help to your family, distributing the cards, that kind of strategy. Larger point here, and there were other strategies too, but I'm going on too long. But the point is, they reduced violent crime in a 7-year window by 42%. And so the point is, not only did it as a strategy, was it a money saver, It engaged citizens as active participants in public safety, and it literally reduced statistical measures of actually improving the level of safety within the Camden community. Camden was once known as the most dangerous city in the US. And those strategies, along with some others, redefined how Camden is understood. So divest, reinvest. And it's a strategy of a social enrichment such that the process is not law enforcement. It's also changing the law enforcement role, because oftentimes law enforcement are called to address issues of mental health, compromised mental health, and other challenges. Then mobilize social workers to address that. That's not a thing that police officers should do. It's not a law, even if it is a law violation issue in terms of civil disobedience. Generally, it's a low-level criminal stuff where an individual is decomping in terms of mental wellness. That doesn't require law enforcement. That requires some form of enriched social work. So there are a variety of reinvestment strategies. So divest is more a narrative device, because it's really about enrichment from a broader inclusionary and social justice.
So one thing I want to mention, somebody in the audience has suggested Dr. Gholdy Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius, is a way to understand what critical race theory really is. And I think emblematic of, part of what we're trying to discuss here today in terms of being an informed citizen and really being in conversation is this notion that we can't just go to our social media echo chambers. We need to talk with one another. We need to have real dialogue. We need to, not polarize everything and just say, it's right or it's left, it's black or it's white, it's, it's red or it's blue. There's a lot in the middle, and I think that's something our nation's really lost. So I want to ask a question that's come in from the audience that's connected to that idea, I think, and maybe Brooke, this one's for you. What would you say to a white person who feels like critical race theory, or another question picks up on the idea of equality as something that scares white people? So critical race theory, equality makes that person feel like they're being blamed for history and current systems that they really don't have control of. What would you say to that person?
Well, if it's an individual or if it's someone you're talking to, I think, the answers can look different. I think if you're looking into self, I think of the phases of like dismantling your personal feelings about your whiteness, almost like the stages of grief. And you kind of go through it all. It's bargaining and anger and I wasn't part of it. I wasn't in the Civil War. Congratulations. We know that. All of the phases you kind of have to process and go through. And I think that's really important work to do with self through journaling, through reading some of the literature, through processing with your other white friends though, right? So don't call a Black person to process through something like that. That is not their work to do. I think another piece of the work, if you are having the conversation with someone who's maybe a little less far along, and by the way, the process is never done because I will always have whiteness it's always with me. It doesn't go away. And it's always part of the privilege and what I walk through the world with. The other piece of it is in the work you do every day, you got to triage. There's some people that have a paper cut and you can have that conversation with them. There's some people with a broken leg and you can really do that work. And I got to tell you, there's some people who it's really tough to get into those conversations with because you don't really see an end. You don't really see an end where they come to your side. I'll share with you, it's still worth the work. You also have to check in with self because if you aren't taking care of yourself, you can't do it. We saw that with legal observing teams last summer when we were just swarmed and we were just going out into the protests. And let me tell you, we weren't as effective because we were exhausted. So you have to take care of self in that. But I remember reading, in college that was at the invisible knapsack of white privilege. And I was so mad. I was like, this isn't me. I don't understand. Everybody goes through it. There's no out to it. We're all swimming in the soup of white supremacy. everybody is, you know, so I think there is a relief in that. And I think you have to find the relief of doing the work. But I think the work is never done. And if you do figure out how to have this conversation with a white person, please call me, because I do have to call my mother later. And that's always really fun. Just kidding. It's not fun. Keep going.
I won't tell your mother.
Just don't tell her. Oh my gosh, she doesn't want to use Zoom. She's not here.
I was going to bring up the knapsack. I mean, you know, it's and for those of you who aren't familiar, I mean, you know, the idea is we all carry around some kind of backpack, and it's a question of what's in it. And for white folks, often, you know, you're not carrying any extra weight, and recognizing the ways in which that manifests in society is pretty difficult sometimes, I think, for folks, but such an important exercise. So I see we're running short on time, or almost short on time. I want to make sure we're respectful of everyone's time. So please, everyone's been able to join us. I want to ask one last question in sort of a lightning round fashion. If you could name one thing that everyone in the audience could do to make themselves a more informed citizen today, what would it be? And I know it's tough, so I'll ask people to be brief. We'll go Javon, Townsend, and then Brooke.
I would say educate themselves, create relationships, intentional relationships, and understand that this work is lifelong. We may not have all the answers, but, you know, to what Townsend said with the Frederick Douglass quote, what can we do from where we're at? You know, so just do something.
Okay, love it. Townsend.
Yeah, that is so tough. So I guess I would say, yeah, just feeding on Javon's point, who are you in fellowship with in ways that can further mission-driven work toward the broader justice you seek? So, for example, my answer is an organization called Reconstruction Incorporated that I have a long history with. It's centered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was founded by a returning citizen, a quote unquote former felon, person returned to community, in fellowship with others to foreground the leadership of returning citizens in furthering justice reform at the community level. And so there are a variety of initiatives and primary domains within the organization, but that's my example. Who can you be in fellowship with that can further small scale, and you want victories, further things where you can get a sense of victory in the short term with to invoke the civil rights phrase, with eyes on the prize toward a broader justice that is long term. But it's fellowship, and Jamon's point, fellowship across differences. The board of the organization is intentionally diverse along LGBT lines, along class lines, along ethno-racial lines, along regional socialization lines. Every bit. Audre Lorde used the phrase, fund of necessary polarities, fund of valuable differences that can be brought together to further shared and unshared mission in fellowship with one another. Sorry.
Wonderful. Brooke, one thing to do to be more informed today.
I'm going to talk to the white people, because I know there's a few of them here. If you are a white person, call a family member that you don't talk to anymore, because I guarantee they are doing harm to a Black person in their life, and you can reach them in ways that Black person shouldn't have to. So reminds me to call my mom. So.
All right, and with that, I'm going to thank each of the panelists. What a wonderful conversation, and we used the word fellowship a few times. Such an honor and a privilege to be in fellowship and community with each of you, fellow Buckeyes. And with that, I'll turn it back to one of my favorite Buckeyes, a double Buckeye, Melissa Wasser.
Thank you, Dean Davies. That was really, really nice. And this honestly felt like a masterclass to me. So I just want to thank Javon and Brooke and Townsend and Dean Davies for having this discussion. It was absolutely incredible. Just really quickly, on behalf of OSUDC, the Black Alumni Society, and the Kirwan Institute, again, thank you so much for joining us in fellowship today. This was educational, it was inspirational, and I feel like we could have 5 more panels on this on how to become more informed citizens. Please stay connected with OSUDC by following us on all of our platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're at OSUDC. You'll get the most up-to-date information, especially for the next event in our year-long Racial Equity and Justice series. So thanks again, stay safe, be well, and go Bucks.